Alex, this meeting is being recorded. Thank you so much for joining us today from the UK. Alexander Gooch is a certified practitioner with APPA, certified philosophical counselor, practicing in the UK. He also teaches writing and critical thinking at Durham University. Critical thinking these days, as Lydia was saying, this must keep you very busy. It's an important job. Falls to us to do it. There's so little of it around. And you have a multitudinous interest, Alex, in political philosophy, psychodynamics, and East Asian philosophy. And you're going to talk to us today about philosophy in the two halves of life. That's great. Are there only two halves, or can we get more? But anyway, without further ado,
we're going to cover that one. Don't worry. Thanks very much, Lou. Before I start, I'm afraid I am going to be using a PowerPoint today, so let me just see if I can share screen with you.
Well, I'll have to enable that, Alex.
Okay.
You can't do this unless I make you a co-host. So bear with me, okay?
Sure.
Make co-host. Now you should be able to share your screen.
Yes, something just changed on here. This looks promising.
Yes, it's promising.
Okay, can you now see my first slide?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. So let me begin. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex, as Lou says. The first thing I'd like to say is I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I feel particularly presumptuous speaking after such an expert practitioner as Lydia. I am a newly minted philosophical counselor. As Lou said, I did my certification this year. I have just finished the process of setting up the structure of my practice and opening my doors, as it were. I have yet to sit down with my first client. So I am not speaking from a position of practical expertise in any sense at all. I also don't have any background as a counselor before coming to this kind of work. My background, as Lou said, is in philosophy and in teaching critical thinking. And so, as I have been in the process of setting up my practice and thinking about this business that I'm getting myself into, of philosophical counseling, certain large questions have started to loom in my mind. And what I'm going to do today is to present to you my thinking through, my sort of tentative thinking through of these questions, in the hope that more experienced practitioners than myself, of whom there are many here, might have things to say when I reach the end of what I have to say. So the questions that have been looming large in my mind are, what kinds of issues are clients likely to bring through the door of a philosophical consulting room like the one I've just opened up? And then for any given type of issue a client might bring, which philosophical writers and which philosophical texts might we turn to in order to approach that situation most usefully, most helpfully? I have the intuition that certain philosophical approaches will be more appropriate in certain situations and others in other situations, but the question in my mind was how to make sense of all this, how to put this into some sort of pattern. Being a teacher of critical thinking, I like classifications, and so what I'm going to present is the tentative, incomplete classification that I have come up with of answers to these two questions. I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to phrase it in terms of these two halves of life. I'm going to talk a little bit about these two halves of life in theory, and as I expect they might manifest in the consulting room. And then I'm going to say in more detail something about how it seems to me that philosophy, not specifically philosophical counseling, but philosophy generally, the whole literature and practice that we consider to be philosophy in the broadest sense, has addressed first half of life issues and second half of life issues as I'm conceiving them here. And then at the end, I'll say a little bit about philosophical systems and how these relate to the two halves of life. There's something there to say about the medical model as well. First, then, the two halves of life. I would like to present you a quote. I promise this is the longest quote I'm going to ask you to read with me today. So, are there perhaps colleges for 40-year-olds which prepare them for the coming life and its demands as the ordinary colleges introduce our young people to a knowledge of the world? No. Thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. Worse still, we take the step with the false assumption that our truths and ideals will serve us as hitherto. But we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. This is from Carl Jung. I was a little bit shy about showing you who this quote was from before I showed it to you, because at least on campuses in the UK, you cannot even mention the word Jung without being laughed out of the room almost immediately. And so again, I'm very grateful to Lydia for having introduced Jung to the conversation before I did. That's a great relief, thank you. So Jung has this idea of two halves of life, and he makes much of this in his approach to psychotherapeutic and psychodynamic practice. I should skip back and say a little bit more about that. Lou asked the very reasonable question, are there only two? Of course, this idea of two halves of life was not unique to Jung. He didn't originate it. He certainly had in mind a traditional Indian system of 4 stages of life, the 4 ashramas. We have similar ideas in traditional Chinese philosophy and so on and so on. This was Jung picking up and doing something with a familiar idea. He divided life into these 2 stages, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to stick with him today with that proviso. So for Jung, first half of life continues from birth until the age of around 40. And as the Jungian author James Hollis says, the first half of life has its primary task, the solidification of the ego, through which the youth gains sufficient strength to leave the parents, go out into the larger world, and struggle for survival and the achievement of desire. It's this sort of establishing oneself as an autonomous adult in the world, which is the task of the first half of life as far as Jung is concerned. I should say I'm not a Jungian, I'm interested in Jung, I'm not a Jungian, but one of the things the Jungians love is to think of things in terms of stories, in terms of the kind of myths, archetypes, etc., cultural manifestations of archetypes which express the ideas. Here we're thinking about many of the works of Charles Dickens follow this kind of trajectory of the young person starting in difficult circumstances, making good by the end of the story. Or the tale of the young King Arthur, starting out as basically a servant in someone else's court, eventually drawing the sword out of the stone and becoming the King of England. This is the kind of trajectory that we have in mind here for the first half of life as the Jungians conceive it. But we succeed in this, we become established as adults, and then a whole new set of problems appear, again, if we follow Jung. There's this quote from Thomas Merton, the Catholic monastic and writer. Jungians love to quote this. I haven't found chapter and verse on it, but at least it's attributed to Merton, who apparently said, people spend their whole lives climbing the ladder of success, only to find, once they reach the top, that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. One finds this quoted again and again when Jungians write about the second half of life. Jung said that many of his patients, many of the people who came to him, were already perfectly autonomous, well-adjusted, successful. They were adulting, as we say, quite happily, and yet that wasn't enough for them. They had a different set of problems. Problems particularly, as far as Jung was concerned, with meaning. Patients or clients, I think he would have called them patients, would have come to him talking about existing structures of meaning falling apart, and or new structures of meaning, new ideas, new beliefs, new values appearing in their lives and challenging, supplanting what had been there before. And of course, both of these kinds of change cause crisis. We're talking here about the idea of the midlife crisis, a term which I believe was coined by Elliot Jacques in 1965. Jacques was a psychoanalyst, I believe, a Kleinian, but writing very much in dialogue with Jung and his work in this area. It was work around this kind of transition. The second half of life, of course, has different kinds of stories attached to it. Dante, in the midst of the journey of life, I found myself in a dark forest, this introduces the second half of life sort of story and trajectory quite nicely. The Odyssey makes another nice example here. Odysseus is married, he has a son, he is a captain of the Greek forces, he's well established as an adult, done the first half of life stuff, and yet in the midst of life, a whole new bunch of problems assail him which he has to deal with. One objection, which I suspect, being a room full of philosophers, you're going to throw at me immediately, and which I'd like to preemptively deal with. So you're going to say to me, Jung is talking about the second half of life as a problem of meaning, which indeed he is. Meaning, you might well say, is an existential concern. Meaning, as we know, if you've read any of the literature on existential therapy and so on, is not the only existential concern. Tillich, in The Courage to Be, famously talks about meaning, death, and guilt as our three big existential issues. Yalom adds isolation in his existential psychotherapy. Why focus on meaning? Why did Jung focus on meaning, not these other issues? And by extension, why are you, Alex, doing this? Two answers to this. Number one, I'm going to try and speak for not much more than 45 minutes, so I'm limited in how much material I'm going to cover. Also, Tillich argued that we do have these three major existential concerns, but that different periods of history are characterized by a focus on different existential concerns. If we look, for example, at the story of the Buddha, which I'm going to speak about a bit later on, the Buddha, for Tillich, lived in what one might call a death culture or a death-concerned culture. The Buddha's concern was with the problem of old age and death, the fact that we're going to die, and that became the focus of his second half of life journey. You move to the Middle Ages Europe, you have the great focus on sin, sin and redemption. For Tillich, that would have been a culture particularly focused on the existential problem of guilt. For us, certainly in the 19th and 20th century and 21st century, for Tillich, meaning is the problem which looms large, the existential issue which looms largest. By no means the only one. We're certainly not immune from issues of death and guilt. We all know this, but Tillich would have said that for reasons that there isn't really time to go into here, but meaning is one that looms particularly large for us. Now, Jung had an answer to the second half of life problems. Jung regarded individuation as the proper response to all these issues. If anyone's not familiar with Jung, very briefly, individuation seems to mean the reintegration into the personality of all the tricky, difficult bits which we've had to shove out of our conscious selves in order to get on with the business of establishing ourselves up to the age of 40. I'm not going to follow him here. I'm going to take Jung's first half of life, second half of life classification, and then I'm going to look not at Jungian solutions to it, but at the range of philosophical responses to the particular kinds of problems that characterize these two phases of life. Another question that you're certainly going to want to ask Jung, and by extension me, is, are you really saying that up to the age of 40, existential concerns never trouble us, and then suddenly by the age of 40, we are established in our lives, we have no further difficulties with our sort of adulting, and suddenly problems of meaning appear? Certainly not. I would imagine that many of us here have been drawn to philosophy because second half of life issues, existential issues, issues of meaning have appeared for us and been relevant throughout our lives. And certainly we all know, all of us who are over 40 know that problems with love and work and so on do not end at the age of 40. It might be worth noting that Jung was writing in mid-century Switzerland, where we can suspect that people's lives followed a rather more predictable and staged trajectory than many of our lives do today. But still, I wouldn't wish that division into first half of life, second half of life to be taken too literally at all. I'm really, as I say, just using it as a classification for two kinds of human concerns. If one's feeling more Aristotelian, one could think of it as First half of life, problems with means, problems of what means am I going to use to achieve my ends? Second half of life, what in fact are the right ends to be pursuing? Am I pursuing the right ones or the wrong ones? How then might all this appear in the philosophical consulting room? To take a couple of examples from our scope of practice, I think that these might manifest as first half of life or second half of life concerns, depending. We have this example in our scope of practice: a male employee is ordered to remove a painting from his office wall because it offends a female colleague. It seems to me that if that client were to come asking the question, how can I best argue my case to the HR department at my work? That's a first half of life concern. That's a concern with getting on with the business of life following the ends which I had established. However, if this person comes to ask, should I remove the painting from the wall? Is there really an ethical issue here? Are my values solid or sound, or do they need re-examination? I'm calling that a second half of life kind of concern. Similarly, a woman's marriage is spiraling towards divorce, another one from our scope of practice. If she were to come with the question, how can I better communicate with my spouse in order to save my marriage? That I would classify as a first half of life concern. Should I stay in this marriage or should I leave? That I'm classifying as second half of life. These are broad generalizations, clearly. This is a very much a bird's eye view, and I'm aware that there's something of there's a Procrustean bed, one might say, going on here, but taken in this very broad sense, that's how I would classify those concerns. And yes, and I should re-emphasize that I'm not suggesting, and nor is Jung suggesting, a linear progression or development from first of life issues to second half of life issues. Two classifications, two categories, no more than that. It seems to me that this division might operate in organizations, organizational consulting, as well as consulting with individuals. If an organization were to come to a philosophical practitioner and say, we want help communicating our values, first half of life concern, a concern with establishing oneself according to the program which one is following unproblematically. If an organization were to come asking, we want help in figuring out what our values are, this more a question of meaning, more of a second half of life concern. So that's the first half of life, second half of life in a nutshell. I'd like to say a little bit more now about how it seems to me that philosophy deals with, or approaches, offers help to people grappling with the different kinds of issues that appear in the different halves, the two different halves of life. As far as first half of life issues are concerned, if we ask, when faced with those issues, with problems, where in philosophy do we turn for help? It seems that often today, at least as philosophy manifests itself and presents itself to the broader culture, Stoicism and Theravada Buddhism are particular sources for the kinds of help, for help with those kinds of issues, those kinds of problems. In terms of Stoicism, there is, of course, CBT and the whole area of therapies which goes around that. A couple of Albert Ellis's books, Albert Ellis, of course, being a big figure in that area, a couple of Albert Ellis's books, both, I believe, co-written, but the titles speak clearly of first half of life concerns, to me at least: how to keep people from pushing your buttons, how to stop destroying your relationships. These are the issues that Jung would have said are the stuff that you have to grapple with in the first half of your life. There's also the contemporary Neo-Stoicism movement, which is very popular among the Silicon Valley elites. It touches on business there. It's also become quite engaged with elite sports. Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way, The Timeless Art of Turning Trials into Triumph, has, I believe, become a big read in elite sports coaching, and it's very much a Stoic-informed book. Then there's James Stockdale. If anyone doesn't know of James Stockdale, he was a US officer. I think he was a Navy pilot in the Vietnam War who was shot down, imprisoned, and tortured for a long time. And he wrote this book, Courage Under Fire, Testing Epictetus's Doctrines in a Laboratory of Human Behavior, describing how he used Stoicism in general and Epictetus in particular, not only to survive those experiences himself, but also to help fellow prisoners get through those experiences as well. So business, sport, even an extreme of human experience like war, all of these, according to that Jungian classification, will fall into first half of life concerns. They're not concerns of meaning, they're concerns of getting on in the world in various different ways. Another nice example I noticed just the other day, an article cropping up on one of the contemporary neo-Stoic forums, the Stoic way to find more time in your day. Finding more time in your day, again, first half of life stuff. And the kinds of advice that the Stoics and the neo-Stoics and the post-Stoics and so on give us in this area, there is much of it, of course. For example, we are advised to be aware of and to learn to avoid cognitive distortions, to apply the dichotomy of control. Neo-Stoicism is quite interested in ascetic disciplines, ascetic practices as well, fasting, taking cold showers, and so on. One reads about these practices in the Neo-Stoic stuff. On Theravada Buddhism, the kinds of approach to first half of life problems that we find in Theravada Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism derived stuff is, of course, primarily mindfulness. Mindfulness-based stress reduction and the broader mindfulness movement, which has come from, basically from Southeast Asian Theravada into so much of contemporary culture now. A couple of recent publications just illustrating how mindfulness is put to work in dealing with first half of life concerns. Anna Black has written this book, Mindfulness at Work, Reduce Stress, Live Mindfully and Be Happier and More Productive at Work. And Laurie Brotto's book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, How Women Can Cultivate Desire. I can't help just pausing to wonder or to think about the Buddhist teachers who first taught the Western students like Jack Cornfield and John Kabat-Zinn, who brought mindfulness over to the West. The teachers like U Pandita and Ajahn Chah, who would have been Buddhist monastics, celibate and committed to the idea that desire is the cause of suffering. Interesting to know how they would have responded to works like that. And of course, the advice that the post-Buddhists give us, the sort of the mindfulness movement gives us, is primarily be mindful, all the practices that go along with that. And often there are other elements of Theravada Buddhism, like compassion practices and so on, which are brought in as well. So that's far from an exhaustive account of how philosophy deals with the first half of life issues, but as a couple of illustrative examples, I hope that would work. Philosophy in the second half of life, I think, is rather more complex. The second half of life, where of course we are established as adults, but as T.S. Eliot says, we are no longer at ease here in the old dispensation. In some sense, the meanings which have sustained us through to this point are shifting, changing, are not as substantial as they were. We are faced with Tolstoy's famous question, what should we do and how should we live? In contemporary language, we might say we are concerned with narratives, the narratives of ourselves, of the world, and our relationship to the world, which give us meaning and sustain our meaning. These are called into question somehow. And so when faced with this kind of second half of life problem, where in philosophy do we turn for help? Again, I'm going to ask you to indulge me in a little bit more Jungianism. Jung loved four-part models and mandalas particularly, so I'm going to suggest that there are kind of four philosophical gangs, four philosophical tendencies, which present different ways to respond to these kinds of problems, and I'm going to present them as roughly a mandala shape. And in the northeast sector, the first section of the mandala, There's the group who I'm calling the group of philosophers, who I'm calling the rationalists, and the presiding deity, of course, there is René Descartes. I should say, as I go through these, I'm only going to briefly describe what I understand them to be. I'm not going to enter into the strengths and weaknesses, just, as I say, a typology, a classification. So it seems to me that if one were to go to a rationalist with a second half of life meaning problem, the rationalist would be characterized by the kind of response that would say, figure out the answer for yourself from the ground up using your own acumen. Think it through, use your own analysis to reach an answer. I'm sure we are all very familiar with this kind of approach, having gone through the study of philosophy where rationalism is certainly, if not a sort of an overridingly strong approach, it's certainly universal. It's everywhere out there. A couple of examples in the field of the study of religion, which is a particular interest of mine. Two writers, David Bentley Hart and Robert Wright, who in their different ways are asking the meaning of life question, particularly as regards religion, and are both answering it in these two relatively recent books in a clearly rationalistic way. David Bentley Hart's The Experience of God argues for the existence of God using logic and evidence in a rationalistic way to attempt to resolve a question of meaning for himself, for his reader, for both. Robert Wright does exactly the same thing with Buddhism. Now, as I said, I am new to practice. I have no experience of practice, but I'm speculating that a rationalist approach to philosophical counseling might involve the client asking that question, should I stay in this marriage or should I leave? And the rationalist philosopher would say, well, let's think this through. Let's try to reach an answer based on logic and evidence. This is the sort of, in some sense, you might say in the popular imagination, this is the classic philosophical, rationalistic approach to a problem. Then we come to the second of my four categories, the conservatives, represented here, of course, by Confucius. A conservative, when approached, well, when faced with a second half of the life problem, would argue, does not say, think it through from yourself from the ground up. Rather, a conservative would say, look at the answers which already exist, look at the answers which have stood the test of time. This might mean the principle of epistemic conservatism, which roughly states that the fact that I already believe something is a reason to go on believing that thing. Not a knockdown reason, not a necessary, not a sufficient reason, but a reason to be taken into consideration. Probably more often, as far as the exploration of issues of meaning is concerned, this is manifested as the idea of the wisdom of tradition, that traditions hand on to us ways of thinking and ways of practicing, ways of living, which have been polished over the generations in a way that we cannot hope to achieve just by our own sheer rationalistic brain power. Represented, particularly in political philosophy, by that line of conservative political philosophers, including Edmund Burke, Michael Oakeshott, and Roger Scruton, although I hesitate to mention Scruton's name, given how rude he was about philosophical counseling. It also has a history in Catholic theology, particularly Cardinal Newman, Alistair MacIntyre, are both in some sense conservative traditionalists, much more nuanced and much more interesting than I'm making this position out to be, but broadly they would fall into that kind of camp as well. It seems to me that if a client came asking the question, should I stay in this marriage or should I leave? A conservative philosopher would not say, well, let's think it through rationally. A conservative philosopher would say, let's look at what the great philosophical traditions have to say about marriage and divorce and seek wisdom there. Third sector of my mandala, the voluntarists, represented of course here by Søren Kierkegaard, would neither say, okay, let's spend a lot of time rationalizing this, figuring it out, nor let's spend a lot of time consulting traditions which have gone before us, but would rather say something like, You're never going to find sufficient reasons to believe something. Just jump in, take that leap of faith. This, of course, has a long history in many philosophical traditions. It's quite pronounced in some kinds of Protestant theology. It appears in Kierkegaard. From Kierkegaard, we find it in Nietzsche, expanded and developed in various ways. It informs existentialism in the broad sense. A client asking our same question, should I stay in this marriage or should I leave, might receive an answer from a voluntarist philosopher along the lines of, make the decision, you need to commit yourself to the decisions as fully as you can. It's the commitment which will break the deadlock which you are in and change the perspective, will allow your stuckness to move forward. Finally, the last of my 4 categories of philosophers responding to second half of life questions, questions of end or meanings, represented there by Bodhidharma, the renunciants. In case anyone's not familiar with Bodhidharma, Bodhidharma was the traditional founder of Chan or Zen Buddhism, and his story centers around an interview that he had with Emperor Wu in the Kingdom of Liang in ancient China. Bodhidharma arrived in China, was brought before Emperor Wu, and they had an increasingly fractious interview, which ended with the emperor saying something like, "And who are you who dares to stand before me and say these terrible things that you've been saying?" Bodhidharma says, "I don't know," stalks out of the room, goes and sits in a cave and meditates for 6 years. And it's this "I don't know" which characterizes what I'm calling the renunciant approach to the question of meaning. It's particularly strong in ZenChan Buddhism and allied philosophies. Another famous expression of it comes from Sung San, the 3rd patriarch of Chinese Chan Buddhism, who said, "Do not seek after truth, only cease to cherish opinions." And the broad message of a renunciant position would be, this grasping for meanings itself is problematic. Don't search for meanings. Either you're better off without them, or at least you're better off resting in negative capability and suspending the search for meaning at the moment. We find this, of course, in skepticism. We find it in deconstructionism and postmodernism, and it's also becoming quite strong in contemporary, at least in British existential therapy. There's a very interesting book just came out this year, edited by a guy called Mano Bazzano, called Revisioning Existential Therapy, which takes very much this line. It's moving away from the voluntarist kind of classic existentialist position, very much towards a renunciant, do not seek truth, remain open to all the possibilities that might be presenting themselves kind of view. The client who comes asking, should I stay in this marriage or should I leave, might receive an answer from a renunciant philosopher, something like, if you're undecided, okay, you're undecided, stay with the indecision, rather than taking any of these paths towards meaning, towards the attainment of some decisive meaning. As I say, this is very crude. Certainly, we could think of other philosophical approaches which would not happily fall into any of these 4 camps. I'm not claiming that this is exhaustive by any means. This is just what I've got to so far in my thinking through of the question of how might philosophy respond to second half of life questions. Also, of course, there might be combination approaches. I would suggest that Popper, with his movement towards truth and away from falsehood, is in some, and his use of logic and evidence to do that is in some sense a rationalist, but in his renunciation of the idea of final achievement of a definitive truth is the renunciant as well. If you add paradigms into that, then that very roughly is the kind of how I would classify Kuhn, and so on and so on. One could add more. Then there's a little bit to say about philosophical systems in the 2 halves of life. If these 2 halves of life and their problems are a legitimate way of seeing things, what then about the philosophies as we understand them? Excuse me. It seems to me that most developed philosophical systems are going to have something to say about both first half of life concerns and second half of life concerns. A nice example of this is Taoism. If you'll indulge me in another quotation, this is part of chapter 65 of the Lao Tzu, where it says, "The ancient masters of the way tried not to enlighten, but to keep people in the dark. What makes people hard to rule is their knowledge. Who rules the realm with knowledge is the terror of the realm." I would suggest that one could read this from a first half of life point of view as a text actually literally about the issue of ruling people, how to rule effectively as a king, an emperor, a leader, or it could be in any other context as well. And the advice seems to be, it's quite direct. There's something almost Machiavellian about it. Lao Tzu, as he often is concerned with the idea of abstract knowledge, knowledge abstracted from lived experience and practice, and the many problems that brings. He seems to be saying, do not try to use that kind of knowledge to rule people, and in fact, that kind of knowledge in people's minds is going to work against you as a ruler. On the other hand, if we read this from a second half of life point of view, which again is very much in the tradition, the Taoist tradition very much does this, we could understand it as a text about how to rule oneself, which makes it much more of a second half of life text, piece of advice. Here we are saying, if I try to rule myself with knowledge, then I'm going to get in trouble. This looks very much like a renunciant approach, as I've classified it, to second half of life concerns. It seems to me that some developed philosophical systems may have more resources for first half of life issues. It seems to me that the Nicomachean Ethics or Confucius's Analects skew more, or at least read more easily as advising us on first half of life issues. Some more second half of life. I expect one would likely open Kierkegaard or Bodhidharma, the founder of Chan Buddhism, with second half of life issues in mind than first half of life. Yeah, there are going to be inflections either way. However, it seems to me, this is a very unscientific observation, but it seems to me that as a kind of cultural observation generally, when people are interested in philosophy right now in our present cultural moment, people come to philosophy more with first half of life concerns than they do with second half of life concerns. My solitary piece of unscientific evidence for this is that part of the list of best-selling books in the philosophy category in Amazon.co.uk at the end of last month. There are 8 books that I've put up here, and it seems to me that at least 5 of these 8 books seem to be presenting themselves as first half of life advice. I certainly haven't read all of them, but number 3, Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life, famously telling us to tidy our bedrooms, classic first half of life stuff. Number 4, Organizing, Crafting, Creating Happiness, that appears to skew in that direction as well, the 48 Laws of Power. William Irvin's Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy is one of the main texts of the Neo-Stoic movement. And Start With Why, How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action. I could almost imagine that quote from Lao Tzu that I was speaking about a few minutes ago, read in the first half of life. Here's how to actually rule people, guide people, could even be quoted in that book. So, as I say, it seems to me there's a general cultural interest in more of the first half of life than second half of life concerns, which is on the surface curious because, for example, Stoicism and Theravada Buddhism surely have plenty to say on second half of life concerns as well. Both have plenty to say about ends as well as the means of life. Both have plenty to say about death. Both speak to guilt, although meaning is not a live, explicit issue for philosophy. There are certainly messages to be drawn there when one goes more deeper into their canons. And indeed, the stories of the 2 founders, the story of Zeno of Citium and the story of the Buddha, are second half of life stories. These are both characters who were doing okay, established an adult life, had made it from childhood to adulthood, and then were assailed by questions or problems of meaning, their life took a different turn. They took that second half of life trajectory. However, both Stoicism and Theravada Buddhism have been widely mobilized for first half of life concerns, as I've said before. This fact, this direction of attention towards first half of life rather than second half of life concerns, and the sort of extraction of technology, as people sometimes put it, from Stoicism and Buddhism to address first half of life concerns, has been a concern in itself for some committed Stoics and Buddhists who feel that this doesn't do justice to these philosophies. Wondering why this is, wondering why there is this skewing towards first half of life issues, there may be a cultural direction to it. This is something that some of the Jungians say. Andrew Samuels is one of the Jungian writers who argues that our culture is first half of life oriented rather than second half of life oriented. He says, we value independence and success, we cannot control our destructiveness, and we have but glimpses of the meaning and purpose of life. I think there's something here about the medical model as well. If it's true that there is a general cultural interest and concern with first half of life issues and something of a backgrounding of second half of life issues, this may be connected to the medical model. In the medical model, as we know, the mind, or the psyche, as Jung would have called it, is understood by analogy with the body. However, the body really has only one set of concerns. The body is concerned with attaining and then maintaining what's sometimes called healthy normal or wellness. You become healthy, you stay healthy. There's really only that one trajectory to be concerned about. However, if we follow Jung, the mind or the psyche, in fact, has these two different sets of concerns. The first half of life concerns can be mapped quite easily onto the concerns of the body and therefore incorporated into the medical model, understood through the medical model. Second half of life concerns don't really have an analogy in the medical model, and therefore it may be that the medical model mitigates against awareness of second half of life and its concerns. That's almost all that I have to say. I would like to finish by raising a question, or trying to articulate a question. It's certainly not a question that I have an answer to, and I'd be very interested to hear from those who have more experience than I do about this question. But this raises for me the question, when a client presents with a first half of life issue, does the counsellor always take the client at their word, always regard this as a first half of life issue, always say, okay, yeah, here's a practical problem. Let us look at different ways in which to solve this practical problem, or at least to address this practical problem. On the other hand, when the client presents first half of life issue, does the counsellor never regard it as the first half of life problem? I know that this is the line that some of my friends in existential therapy take. For some of them, it's almost axiomatic that therapy must always be about transformation. Mere problem solving is not really the business that we should be in here. Or on the other hand, does one take something more like what I've called a renunciant approach? Does one reserve judgment and wait to see what will emerge as the dialogue goes on? I don't know, as I say, I don't know what the answer is, but it is one of the questions which presents itself to me as I think through the business of starting up as a philosophical counsellor, and I'd be interested to know what anyone else thinks. Just to finish with a summary, there is the classification that I presented. Philosophy in the two halves of life being divided into first half of life issues, examples of ways of dealing with those or approaching those, addressing those are the Stoic and the Buddhist approaches. And then in the second half of life, the rationalist, the conservative, the voluntarist, and the renunciant approach. And there appears to be, I'd be interested to know if you agree with me, but it seems to me that there is a general interest in first half of life philosophy, or in philosophy as a way of addressing the first half of life. That is all that I have to say. Thank you for your time and attention. And any comments, any questions will be most welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really wonderful. Would you please unshare your screen so we can? Thank you so much. I know that there are going to be all kinds of questions and comments, so fasten your seatbelt because you're in a room full of counselors with varying and widely dispersed experience, and I know many of them are going to want to interject. So I'm going to invite that, and you've very thoughtfully left us a half hour to do it. So I think you'll get some very useful feedback. I would just, before calling on questioners, I would like to shoot from the hip, if I may, and just give you my short and choppy response. All right?
Please do.
Okay, just bear with me. I'm going to stop.